right, so let's get started. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. At the end, you'll be able to unmute yourself, or you can use the chat at the bottom. You can raise your hand, we'll unmute you, or I think you might be able to unmute yourself, or you can go to the Q&A and ask questions. You can ask the questions during the webinar, and then we'll get to them in 15 minutes or so, or just wait and ask them at the end. Either one works. So again, I'm Lenny, one of the co-founders and the CEO of protocolsio. My background is in genetics and computational biology, and I will be talking in this webinar for the next 10-15 minutes. I will be talking about some of the frequently asked questions that we get about the appropriate ways and time of sharing early on protocolsio. So some of these common questions are concerns, if you're academic, they are concerns about journal publication later on. Will it be a problem if you share the method on protocolsio? The more common concern is, I'm not 100% sure about my protocol. I'm worried that I might have typos. It hasn't gone through peer review. Is it too early to share? Will my credibility as a scientist suffer? So there's a concern about that, errors and robustness of the methods, the types of methods that we're sharing. Oh, and somebody said I'm not hearing any audio. Ruth, can you try to dial into the webinar? The Zoom invite should also have dial-in instructions, so then you could see it. If you have the phone with you, you should be able to dial in, and you can then have the audio through the phone and still see the presentation. And I don't know why I'm telling Ruth this if she cannot hear the audio. There. Thank you, Anita and Nastya, for adding the dial-in info. So if you're having trouble hearing, just dial in, and you can then view the slides on the screen and listen through the phone. So another question is, what are the types of methods? Does it have to be new, groundbreaking technique that you developed? Can you share more basic things? What fits into protocolsio? Is my method right and appropriate for protocolsio? So we'll go over that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the ways before you're ready to really make it public, the ways of sharing within groups, particularly large groups or just a few collaborators, and what if it's a consortium or a large group? What are the ways of sharing with your colleagues? And at the end, we'll also touch on private sharing within a company. So we'll have a few things to say about biotech and pharmaceuticals using us. So when I typically give a talk on protocolsio, I start with one of my favorite tweets on the topic of method sharing from a postdoc, Morgan, at UC Riverside, who said, I'm looking for a protocol in a 97 paper as described in 96, find 96 paper as described in 87, find 87 paper, it's paywalled. And that, of course, is a common and really frustrating experience. This tweet is from a biologist, Morgan. Here's one from a physicist. Similarly, devices were fabricated as previously described, previously described, previously described. Devices were fabricated with conventional methods. And I have scores and scores of complaints like this that I've been collecting in a growing list of my favorites. It's a really, really common problem. And so the mission of protocolsio is to make it easy to share method details before, during, and after publication. So improving the details in the papers that are published, making it easy to share corrections and optimizations. And for this webinar, I really want to emphasize and focus this whole webinar on the before part. So why is that? And that's because the before can really accelerate method development and the pace of research itself in the same way that we share preprints, because that speeds up publication by months and sometimes a year or more. there are ways to share your methods, some methods, and protocols long before you even have a preprint. And whether public or semi-private, this kind of sharing can really accelerate the development of the techniques, the troubleshooting, enabling others to make progress long before the results based on the methods that you've developed are ready to be in a paper and shared more widely. So in a similar way that you exchange knowledge at a conference, there are a lot of pros to sharing early, but there are things to keep in mind. So the first question is about journal publications. For those in academia, you need to publish, you need the papers, and the question is, if I share the full method on protocolsio, can I still turn it into a paper, right? Will it get me into trouble when I'm doing it with a paper? We have not, since we launched in 2014, with thousands and thousands of researchers using protocolsio, we have never had an issue around this. In fact, journals actually encourage authors on submission to use protocolsio to make their papers more reliable and reproducible. So we've never had problems, whether it's open access or subscription journals. We have a lot of partners. Some of them you can see on this slide, but there are more than 500 journals now that actually have protocolsio in the author guidelines. They encourage you to share, and some of them, if you look, for example, at the guidelines from Public Library of Science, so this is PLOS Genetics, they have a whole section on how to share on protocolsio. They say we recommend and encourage you to deposit lab protocols in protocolsio. And at the bottom, I'm emphasizing, they actually tell you can share at any time. You don't have to wait for the paper to come out. So when your paper comes out, your protocol will automatically be made public. But they explicitly say you could make your protocols public at any time by selecting publish on the protocolsio site, right? And if you think about bioRxiv, if you think about preprints, the vast majority, 95% plus of journals do not consider sharing a preprint to be a prior publication, right? Because it hasn't been peer reviewed. That applies even more strongly to protocols because you're not even sharing a full paper. You are sharing just the steps, just the methodological steps, right? And reagents that you're using, or the code and scripts from your analysis. So it's not a full paper. We've never had an instance of journals complaining about this. And we even see many examples of people sharing very early, not just parts of papers, research papers, which have interesting results, and they share methods on protocolsio to give the details of how they've done the work and arrived at the interesting discoveries. But method papers, protocol papers, new techniques frequently appear on protocolsio, and then a year or two later, people send them for peer review and turn them into a method paper at Nature Protocols or Nature Methods, or one of the many, many other journals that accept peer-reviewed protocol method publications. So that, I think, is one of all the questions that we will be talking about on this webinar. That, I think, is one of the easiest ones. So we've never had an issue with journals. And now let's get into slightly more challenging territory. When we publish papers, we ideally are pretty confident about the results. It has gone through peer review. You've spent years as a graduate student or postdoc on the work, and you're standing behind that when you submit that paper or preprint typically, right? What happens if you're not 100% sure? If you haven't gotten the error bars, what happens if you're concerned about errors? And what happens if you don't know if your method is going to work in the hands of others? You've gotten into work, maybe you don't even know if other people in your lab can reproduce it. So can you share that? Do you wait a couple of years? What if it can really accelerate and enable other people? Right? So it's not a trivial question. For the errors, what we do at protocolsio is, and this is really a critical part of the whole mission of protocolsio, and one of the reasons why I give up my academic career to do this full time, is to make it easy to fix errors and to share optimizations, because we really passionately believe that methods are dynamic, they're evolving creatures, they're not final like a paper and results, they're not just snapshots, they evolve. By the time you publish the paper, you might already know that there's a better library for the computational analysis, there is a better kit to do the work that the wet lab work that you've described. So these things evolve, and you discover that 30 degrees is better than 35. So what we do for that is we make it really easy to share those corrections and optimizations. And if you have whatever error, even if you've made it public and it has a DOI and is citable, or maybe even cited in a publication, you can always make a new version. It gets a new DOI for citation, which is an identifier. And with a click of a button, people actually can see there's a compare button on each protocol that allows you to see what's the same and what's different between the versions. Anybody who gets to an earlier version of the protocol that you shared will see a pop-up telling them, are you sure you want to look at the earlier version? Because there's a newer one available. So that's, if you forget a co-author, if you have a typo in the word plates, you can fix that with a few clicks, right? And when you have optimizations, you're welcome to come back and share them in the same way. The other part is, if you're making the protocol public, you're going through a very simple 5-step publishing flow on protocolsio. So this is, imagine I clicked publish on my protocol. And the second step, after you set the co-authors, the second step asks you to self-label, self-certify, is this a working protocol? Is it in development? Or is it something else, right? And so this is the part where if you're unsure, you can say, you know what, I've tried it a handful of times, I'm sharing this early, right? It may not be very robust, it may take troubleshooting. So you can put a note in the details, you can say it's in development, or you can say it's a negative result. So this is a part for you to label how robust you think this protocol is. And when anybody comes to view it, under the title, the label will show up. If they mouse over it, there is a pop-up. So here's an example of a protocol which said other. We have some that say in development. We have some that say it's working in our lab, right? And here, when you mouse over it, says we attempted to use this to transform this particular species, but it did not succeed. This collection provides protocols that we use to arrive at the transformations, and everything included should work. But they're letting us know that they tried it, but it didn't work in as robustly, right? Which I think is a protest. So you can label, and you can certify how you think it works. There's a question that just popped up, and feel free not to hold them till the end. A good question on the versions that we covered just 2 slides back is, can you hide a version if they have a typo, or will others always be able to see them? So because this is science communication, research communication, this is publishing. Once you've made it public, because people might have linked to it, we don't let you erase it. So people will still be able to navigate to an older version, but what we do is automatically guide everyone to the most recent version. So if somebody searches on protocolsio, it's the most recent version that will pop up. If someone clicks on your profile, it's the latest version, not 15 different ones that will be there. And as I said, if someone actually clicks and navigates somehow from a tweet or another link on the internet or in a published paper to an older version, we instantly give them a pop-up and steer them to the most recent version. But we can't erase previous versions because they might be cited, and that would lead to a lot of problems with reproducibility and with knowing what exactly was done. My real honest answer is we all make mistakes, right? And even in our published papers, it's an illusion that peer review can remove all mistakes from papers. So the best thing is just to acknowledge that we have typos, that we make mistakes, and use the versioning to correct them. And I think people should be rewarded for doing that. I think it's setting us up for pain and slower progress if we try to strive for perfection and lack of typos. So we talked about the versioning and certification, and then the next question is, well, what if I want to share? If I'm part of a group on protocolsio, it can be a public group or a private group, visible group or hidden group. But what if I'm part of a community, right? So here's one of the many hundreds of communities that we have on protocolsio, Human Cell Atlas Method Development Community. There are 300 plus members. I think it's closer to 400 now, lots of publications. What if I want to share, but I don't want to make it public and I'm still editing it and it's really, really early, right? Without getting a DOI, without fully making it public, are there ways of doing so? So if you go to the group folder, you can actually add a protocol that will be visible to the members of the group and only to those who are signed in. Right? And so I am a member of the group, and you can see here it says that there are 34 protocols that have been shared in the group folder that are not part of these 105 publications. Anybody else who comes to this public visible group, anybody else who comes to it only sees these 105. It's only the people who are explicitly members, who are signed in, and members of the Human Cell Atlas group that can navigate to the group folder in the file manager and see the earlier protocols that are still in development and have not been formally made public on protocolsio with the DOI. Okay. Another thing is, if you have a private protocol, there is a share button right at the top. There is a share button, and just like Google Docs, you have refined controls. So if it's really early and you're not yet ready to share it with the community, of hundreds of people, but you want to share it with a few colleagues, with collaborators, you can click share. And just as in Google Docs, you can type in individual emails. You can set the permissions of whether they're only able to view or also to edit. So you decide what permissions to give to your collaborators. And if you're really concerned, we've had some instances where you have a large consortium, you want to make sure that people don't make the protocol public before the paper is ready because it's a new technique you're developing and you're afraid of being scooped. We also have on the abstract page, when you're in the editor, on the, not abstract, on the guidelines and warnings, there is a checkbox. You can see down below under sensitive content, there is a checkbox that says confidential. And if you click on that, anybody who opens your protocol is going to get this notice that this is confidential, do not print, make screenshots, or distribute. You're still relying on the good faith of others, but you're adding this warning to remind people that this is very, very early. Okay. And in the last 2 minutes before we open it up for questions, in the last 2 minutes, I want to talk about what are the types of methods that we share. So we're used to research papers that have method sections. Obviously, you need to describe that. And as I showed, there are a lot of journals that encourage you to share not just a vague description in a few sentences or conventional methods, as we saw in the initial tweets, but that encourage you to share the step-by-step details. So we're used to that. We're used to method papers where you have a novel technique. But the important thing to note about protocolsio is that we are not here for just a new technique. We're a platform where you can share slight tweaks, optimizations. You can share very basic recipes, and you might be developing a new technique. You might be working towards a really interesting discovery, and you're racing against other groups, and maybe you don't want to share fully the method before you've published it. That's legit. That's totally reasonable. But if you make on the way towards that, if you're doing this research and you're in this race for 3-4 years, if you make improvements to common buffers, that's really not how you're going to be winning against other scientists. And you can share basic things that you've optimized in transformations and buffers and computational analysis without giving away what exactly the new technique is or what exactly the new research discovery is that you're about to publish in 4 years. And so a good example of this, one of the many such examples on protocolsio, is from the Axman lab at the Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf. And they've had their entire lab just had a hackathon, sat down and decided we really don't want methods disappearing when people graduate. And the entire lab sat down and just shared all of the common techniques that they use in their lab. They share them publicly. Some groups do that privately. But as a result, you can see some of the things that they've shared are very basic methods. Here's a computational reciprocal best hit blast. Very classic, basic bioinformatics technique. Here's a recipe for a really common, like 5-step recipe for common TAE buffer. And just notice how many people are viewing this over the last 2 years. There are 64,000 views of the TAE buffer, right? There are 10,000 views of the reciprocal best hit blast. Really basic recipes. This is not how you're going to outcompete people. There really shouldn't be anything you're giving away if you tell people that you have a nice, clean recipe for the following media or buffer. So you can share things years, in this case, you can share some things years before your paper or preprint is ready, and you can really accelerate the progress of science by doing that. And the last thing before I take questions, the last thing I wanted to touch on is kind of the exact opposite of everything we've talked about for academia, for the students and postdocs. It's what about the opposite problem? If I'm sharing inside a company with intellectual property concerns, I don't want people to take it outside. I don't want people, if they've been fired from the biotech, I don't want them suddenly making things public. If they delete their account or leave the company, I don't want their methods to disappear. And so for private groups, we have in the file manager, if you open a group, if you're the group administrator, at the very top, there is a settings button that opens up the settings for your group. And you can see that you have a lot of control in terms of what you allow the members of the group to do. You can prevent them from sharing files outside of the group, prevent them from moving it, or removing, deleting files. So only you as administrator can delete files. Maybe you're in a company where you don't want people to get DOIs and publish. You can disable that, right? So you have a lot of control, and maybe it's only 1 or 2 people within your organization who have the permission to publish. Maybe there's a process for vetting it before it goes live. So you can have that logic. You can have those restrictions and permissions set within a group. Obviously, if you have a private group, if you're in academia, you have access to this as well. But typically, these settings are things that we see used in private companies and industry, not in academia. So with that, I will stop. I'll keep my sharing on, and I will be delighted to take other questions. And again, you can type them in or raise your hand. We'll unmute you and you can just ask. And before that, I don't know Nastya, I don't know if Nastya, or I need to mention that this is being recorded. So if you are unmuting yourself and speak, just keep that in mind. So please don't curse and scream at me if you disagree. And let's see, in the Q&A, it said I typed my question in the Q&A section.
Lenny, hi, this is Anita from protocolsio. Can you see the Q&A?
Oh, panelists. Okay, I should be able to see it now.
And if somebody wants to unmute themselves, please raise your hand and then we will be able to unmute you. I don't think you can unmute yourself.
So I think I clicked onto Q&A for some reason. Oh, there it is. Now it popped up. Sorry about that. If we need to delete an older version for a legal or privacy reason, can we do so? Yes, so there are companies that share, there can be patent disputes, right? Issues about protocols, there can be real errors, like you figure out, whoops, this really doesn't work, I don't want to mislead people. You can get in touch with us. There is a retraction mechanism. There is a way to remove things. We just have to do it properly, like any publishers. So if you contact info@protocolsio and you let us know which protocol and what the reasons are, it goes to our editorial team, and certainly we can take care of that. So if you need to retract something or hide it with a legitimate, valid reason, then yes. Sam was asking, what about sharing? If we share a protocol with someone or a group, but then create a new version, will the new version be shared? With every version, with every fork, with every branch that you create, sharing is an explicit decision. So if you have version 1 of the protocol, you share it with colleagues, then you create version 2, you have to decide to enable that sharing, because maybe version 2 is just for yourself, maybe you're not ready, maybe you're unsure. So at every single point, the sharing is not automatic. Which groups, which individuals, whether you make it public, is always up to you. If you have a public protocol and then you create a new version, that version is private. You can share it with other people until you explicitly decide to make it public as well. So I hope that answers the question. Sam, feel free to type in or ask if you have other details you'd like to hear. Then there's a question. I have several protocols in a protocolsio folder, but now realize these would be better suited to be in a group. Can I move all of them? You can move all of them. You can, if they're public ones, so you can move, you can just drag within the file manager. If these are private and private, for organizational purposes, you just want to drag a protocol into a private group, invisible group. You should be able to do that easily in the file manager and put them in a group. If these are public protocols, at any point before, when you're publishing them, when you're making them public, or later, you can associate a protocol with one or more groups. So as we showed you, the German lab, Exmon lab, they have protocols collected within their group, and a protocol can be part of one or more groups. It might be part of your individual lab and then a wider community. So you decide which groups that you're part of, a protocol belongs in. And if you need a demo of this, you can always request a one-on-one demo or email us, and we'll get on a Zoom call with you, or by email, send you screenshots and show you how to do that easily. But you should be able to just drag it in.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I asked that question, so thank you.
Excellent. Okay, other questions? What if a protocol is published and associated with a group, and I publish the new version? Will the new version not be associated with the group? Again, in the publication flow, I showed that there are 5 steps. So at any point, just as with sharing, at any point when it's a new version, if you're publishing, it will ask you still share with these groups, and you can change your mind. Maybe it's no longer appropriate, but should be. So we make it easy to do that, but you can make that decision. You can add the new version to additional groups at any point as you're making it public or later. and people should be able to navigate to the new version regardless of whether it's shared with the group or not. If I think we're a little bit over time, so I want to make sure I'm here. I'm not running away. I'm happy to keep answering questions, but I want to make sure to thank everybody, and also to say that if you have a question later on today or at any point, this is my email, lenny@protocols.io. So if you wanted to ask something or think of asking something a little bit later, just email that. And you can also always use the help or info@protocols.io to get in touch with any other questions. And I'll stay on for a few more minutes if other people have anything else they'd like to ask. Thank you, everybody, for joining.